So the question is, has COVID fundamentally transformed the publishing ecosystem? So the easy answer is no. In 2020, in spite of budget problems that made planning difficult for most academic libraries, one of the things we observed was that the pandemic led to an unequal outcome between publishers and their customers. Revenues and profits for the publishers, at least the ones that published their financial results. Revenues and profits grew in 2020, and they're poised to continue to grow in 2021, and probably they will grow in 2022 as well. The best the publishers could do last year to help their customers was to often offering to keep price increases flat for 1 year. But that was not a whole lot when it was seen from the other side of the negotiating table. Just for context, SPARC conducted a survey of its members, found that 75% of respondents had incurred some budget cuts. The full majority, 51% of respondents, had incurred cuts deeper than 5%. Now, equity is not, underscore, not a trait of an ecosystem that's not working well or that's changing. In many industries, outcomes are unequal. It is a problem, however, when one of the parties involved claims it wants to be a partner of the other participants. These claims, particularly in difficult financial conditions, trigger cynicism and skepticism. And this leaves the ecosystem with a dubious distinction on having an unusually high level of hostility among its members. Just looking around in other professional information and data businesses, banks do not want to put real-time financial data companies out of business. Ask law firm librarians, they negotiate hard the price of legal databases, but they do not wish to see their suppliers being expelled from the marketplace. So there's a hostility here that's largely unknown in the rest of the professional information and data landscape. And while this is not new news, it's another step towards inserting a cleavage within the ecosystem. Now, there are many industries, as I said earlier, that have unequal outcomes, and some of them are highly effective in delivering what they want to deliver to their customers. The most important observation out of the pandemic is that it has highlighted the ineffectiveness of this ecosystem. Think about it. If curing a pandemic requires suspending all the rules of a system, accelerating dissemination through preprints, suspending subscription access to back files, foregoing APC-based open access publishing fees, then there is something that doesn't work in the system. It's true, the publishers went out to the investment community and paraded the number of articles they made available, but they forgot, perhaps for brevity, that they did so because they were asked, and asked again by funders and health authorities to do so. And that it had to be asked again because the initial releases were viewed as inadequate by the academic community and research community. So, if the rules have to be suspended to save the lives of COVID patients, on what grounds will we revert and continue to apply the same rules for research on cancer, on Alzheimer, on loss of biodiversity, on climate change? Think about that. So let's return to the original question. Has the ecosystem changed? I would argue that yes, it has changed. It has changed because it's clear to many people in society, from the investment community to politicians, that there is less reason to support an ecosystem that doesn't work when it's necessary to address the most fundamental challenges we face. In fact, it may even not be a good investment to support an industry that's essentially ineffective when it matters most. And I am not going to touch the ethics of telling patients that any of their diseases are any less deserving. So we may not see yet, in part because we are lost in the fog of scientific news, because we're lost in the fog of quarterly results, or in the fog of annual budgets. But I would pose that an ecosystem that has to be subverted when a crisis manifests itself is an ecosystem that's fundamentally endangered. And with that, I'm ready to take questions. I'll leave more time for questions because I would like to discuss this.
If you've got any questions, please do put them into the Q&A. We're keeping an eye on that. Sven, do you want to get the Q&A part started?
Yeah, of course. I mean, this was as provocative as I had hoped, at least. And I think, Claudio, what you are saying is it might not be an industry and not a good investment if you need to suspend the rules just to be productive and to fulfill the hopes that a lot of customers and clients have in you. So do you see anything of that mirrored in observers that are a little bit more cold-blooded than people in the industry might be on this topic, which is financial investors? Is there any impact of this where you can see that financial investors are turning away from publishing because they see this critical point as critical as you do?
If you look at share prices, not yet. So I caution anyone to think that I'm providing stock picking recommendations. Sami Kassab, who speaks later today, who was one of my former competitors and a terrific one, by far the best I ever had, can tell you a lot more about how investors are thinking day to day in the current market. But there is a tendency in the investment community to look at factors like the impact companies have on the environment, on society, and that impact is increasingly scrutinized. So far, publishers have been treated nicely, in large part because their ecological footprint, their carbon emissions are relatively modest. But it will be interesting to see going forward whether people continue to believe that restricting access to knowledge in some shape or form is coherent with societal values.
Now, we could argue that the industry is underway, changing quite dramatically, I would say, over the last decade at least. Maybe not fast enough, but I think given the traditional slowness in the industry, relatively quick. So do you think that this, the observations you have made will have an impact on the speed of transition? And do you think that publishers will learn basically the lesson that you're observing for the next years going forward?
Change can probably come in a couple of different ways. If it comes from the investment community, it will be relatively slow. It will be a set of decisions, asset manager by asset manager, engaging with the companies, asking them to change certain traits of their business model in order to work better with the academic community. And that will take a relatively long time to happen. There's another possibility. There is another scenario where regulators simply step in. Legislation somewhere that simply mandates green open access over a short period of time with no embargo periods, that will have a dramatic effect on the industry. So it's hard to predict how this will play out, but the pressures will increase.
You're obviously not assuming that publishers themselves change course, right? Because you are mentioning two external factors that might trigger learning and change. So if you look at other social movements, Fridays for Future or something, what happens if we suddenly find young publishing employees for openness or whatever kind of movements? Can that happen? Do you think there is enough energy for change from within?
Yes and no. First of all, there have always been employees who were not happy with the current model. You probably, all of us know some of them. They ended up working in advocacy groups. They ended up going somewhere else. But more fundamentally, I would argue that that there are things the industry could easily change under pressure, either from within or outside. So often there are pricing structures that are not transparent, difficult to understand even for the libraries that sign the contracts. Those could be made better. Certain negotiating tactics are just designed to win the upper end in a negotiation, but they are fundamentally unfair and also easy to correct if companies became serious about doing that. And I doubt it will change much their bottom line. The fundamental problem here is that you have a business model that's very expensive. It's predicated on having lots of costs that can be passed on to customers and a very high profit margin. And that simply flies in the face of providing access to everyone. When you have such high prices, you have such high cost base and such high profits expectations, you have to have high prices. Those prices can take different forms. They can be APCs, they can be subscriptions, but almost by definition, high prices become exclusionary.
If you were a publisher, how would you react to your own observations? What would you do? What is the right direction of travel?
Continue to do what they're doing, continue to argue that they provide a very valuable service by publishing the version of record, and that service needs to be paid for in one shape or form, in one form or the other. That's the fundamental discussion that's happening. It is very arguable that that's the right approach, but obviously that is the recent tech. When I started looking into this industry 15 years ago or so, the argument was that open access was bad for science. I was told so in so many words by a couple of publishers. So it was clearly the view. No one has the courage to stand up and repeat that today. So the battleground has moved to the version of record. But in a world where knowledge continues to evolve and doesn't evolve in a linear way, and where the reciprocal influences and understanding of science and its advancement is a lot more complex than simply one version of record, even that battle looks like a rear guard battle and not necessarily one that can be sustained for a long time.
Are there any other questions? Because I could go on for hours, but anybody else who has questions, please use the chat function then. Claudio, maybe one additional question from my end while other people join me. I would say that the ecosystem has changed a bit through a number of startups and different companies that basically were out of the ordinary and joined the space over the last 10 years. Any impact by them that you see that brings a kind of behavioral change, or do you think that that is simply not relevant for the field?
There are attempts. Some of them are extremely interesting. There is a huge amount of interest in innovation in this industry, or in this ecosystem, as we called it. As you probably are aware, a lot of the most interesting initiatives tend to be co-opted in some shape or form by the leaders. There's been consolidation, and not so much consolidation in the sense of putting together larger and larger portfolios of journals. It has happened to some extent, of course, we all know that. But what's interesting is to see how the leading publishers are really acquiring a lot of the startups and effectively controlling other elements that could create a completely different distribution model. And so when we see innovative platforms that are acquired by leading publishers, when we see service companies being acquired by leading publishers, IT companies acquired by publishers, that's what we are effectively seeing, the co-opting of innovation.
Wonderful. Thanks, Claudio. This was a great start.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Yes, indeed. Thank you.